It's only week 3 and it's already a fun college football season. Why? Because everybody, and I mean just about everybody, looks vulnerable. Even some teams that haven't played anybody, really played anybody, look vulnerable. Looking at you, Ohio State, looking at you, Alabama. Of course, those teams. Florida State today against Boston College. And yes, the defending national champion Georgia Bulldogs, 24-14. So we will take the negative. We will take the positive. Yes, the Bulldogs look like they can be beaten because they took on a South Carolina team that lost to North Carolina a couple weekends ago by double digits. And so Georgia looked like at home, like they were ripe for the picking there in the first half, down 14-3. What happened? Well, on the offensive side of the ball for South Carolina, they were calling up some really good plays for some big-bodied receivers that were giving Georgia fits. We know about Juju Wells. We know about Trey Knox, the incoming transfer from Arkansas, that he wasn't utilized there as much as he probably should have been. And Xavier Legette has been one of the biggest playmakers in college football the first 2 weekends with just about 300 yards receiving from Spencer Rattler. And on this day, 71 yards. So between those 3 big guys and others in the passing game, Rattler was on target. And actually, what might have been a bigger factor in the first half was Spencer Rattler was dodging and breaking tackles. And the Georgia pass rush, we expected the South Carolina offensive line to have its hands full. They did against North Carolina in some of the more devastating pass rushing that we have seen in this early season. North Carolina had 16 tackles for loss. They had 9 sacks against South Carolina. So how would the Gamecocks possibly handle Georgia's NFL defense? They really didn't in the first half, except for Spencer Rattler handled the rush almost exclusively by himself. He was taking off with the football. He was running in the secondary. He was dodging. He was juking. He was breaking tackles. He was a man on a mission. He ran for 35 yards, but you take away the sacks, and he did much better than that. And again, he was keeping plays alive. He was finding guys. And, hey, 2 efficient drives here. South Carolina went 10 plays, 65 yards for the first touchdown drive, 5 plays, 80 yards a little bit later for the touchdown. And South Carolina led this game 14-3. Now, there was still plenty of time left, not really time to get nervous about this one. The South Carolina defense, was it really holding up? No, it was more about the Georgia offense just completely being out of sync. Carson Beck's first big game with the weight of the offense on his shoulders as the starter, SEC opener. This is finally it for him. He's the guy. Well, it turned out well, but in the first half, did not look good. So we go to the break, and South Carolina head coach Shane Beamer said, you know what, we're kicking their butts. That's what he told the sideline reporter. We're kicking their tails. Maybe he said something differently. I don't know. That's how it was interpreted. But he said, we do need to keep this up for the second half. Well, I think all of us knew that they probably wouldn't, but we were still intrigued. Georgia was a 28-point favorite in this game, and South Carolina, yeah, they were kicking tail in the first half. Now, they came out in the second half. The rain kept coming down, and this turned into a bit of a slugfest, more of a grind-it-out kind of game, more run game, controlled passing game until South Carolina got behind because Georgia took off from there for a number of reasons. One, Carson Beck looked really sharp. The pass protection was phenomenal. But what happens when offensive linemen who already love to run block, when they get some mud under their cleats, then they really love to run block. And that's what happened to this Georgia offensive line. They took this game over. It was the Georgia offensive line more than any other unit on the field taking this game over, making it much easier, more comfortable for Carson Beck in the second half. And also, let's consider this. I know Michigan's won the Joe Moore Award the last 2 years. Michigan has an excellent offensive line and should again this year, despite 2 big losses along the front. But Georgia has had the best offensive line in college football the last 2 years. Forget the trophies. They've had the best offensive line, and they showed to have the best offensive line, at least in Athens, Georgia, in the second half. They took over the game. They led the way for Deshaun Edwards to rack up 118 yards on 20 carries. Brock Bowers did his thing when he gets the ball in his hands. Shoot, there was a time when they threw him a little pitch pass, little jet sweep, and he took off, and the South Carolina safety had a beeline on him, and then he didn't even catch him. And Bowers turned the corner and gained about 10 yards. There were a couple times when he got a little doink pass underneath and just barreled guys over. Brock Bowers, it seems like he's been playing like he's an NFL player. It's been like 9 years. But ever since he arrived on the scene in 2021, about midway through that season, it was easy for all of us to see best tight end in college football, one of the best players in college football. He's refined his game, and he's phenomenal. 7 catches for Bowers. And again, they couldn't tackle him. And when it started to become a game of let's man up in this one, yeah, Georgia was too much for South Carolina. But hey, South Carolina did not get blown out in the second half. They hung in there. And also 2 threats in the Georgia passing game that they didn't have last year via Missouri, Dominic Leavette, via Mississippi State, Ra Thomas. Those guys came to play, and they showed up, and they made big catches on the drives in which Georgia took over the game to get within 14-10, then 17-14, then, of course, 24-14 final score. So 3 consecutive touchdowns for Georgia. Big plays in the passing game, downfield, and these 2 guys in particular. They both finished in the top 5 in the SEC in receiving yards. Ra Thomas actually one of the top 5 in touchdown receptions. So we knew they were big additions. We talked about them all off season, and they came through for the first time in a game that was tightly contested. Then also we got to consider that all those plays that Spencer Rattler made in the first half where he was dodging guys and breaking into the secondary were, well, Georgia had just as devastating a pass rush, and even more so in the second half. Spencer Rattler, though, they were closing and finishing the plays on defense in the second half. So Spencer Rattler basically running for his life. What can he do? He's got no support from a running game that had 7 carries from the running backs for 19 yards, that had -2 in that loss to North Carolina, -2 yards rushing. He's got to do everything himself. He went 25 for 27, last week against Furman. Spencer Rattler has had a really good 3 games. If you break down the game tape, he had to throw the ball out of bounds I don't know how many times because he's running for his life. He was behind the sticks the entire second half. Got some things going, moving between the 25s a few times, threatening, but never scored. Never scored again, never really seriously came close to scoring. And there it is for South Carolina. They've got to coach up their offensive line. They've got to find a back who can take some pressure off Spencer Rattler. Now, South Carolina, they've got a game coming up against Mississippi State in Bryce Williams Stadium next Saturday night. I'm sure they're happy it's a night game to get back on track after a 1-2 start, losing the SEC opener. So for South Carolina, they're looking at a 6 or 7 win season most likely. They face one of the toughest schedules in college football, the SEC, plus Clemson, North Carolina. For Georgia, what does it look like? Well, they face no great teams, no teams that we expect to be in the hunt for the SEC or for a national championship aside from Tennessee. But looking up until the 1st of November, a lot of decent teams, a lot of teams like we saw today against South Carolina under the right circumstances, the right conditions, the right game plan that Shane Beamer obviously put together with his staff and their new offensive coordinator there, could possibly trip up Georgia under the right circumstances. Auburn, Kentucky, Florida, got to face those 3 teams. And also Missouri. Look at Mizzou today defeating Kansas State, a pretty good Kansas State team. So Georgia's going to be so much better than everyone they play up until Tennessee, and maybe even them, like they were last year. But there is a pack of teams that we just named, like South Carolina, very much on that level of South Carolina, that could challenge Georgia if Georgia throws out a C-, D+ game and one of these teams is hot, especially at home. This was done between the hedges. So Georgia, possibly vulnerable, but of course they did have those Kent State and Mizzou games last year and still marched on to a national championship. Your thoughts about the Bulldogs and the first real test for Carson Beck and this team in 2023 as we march ahead right here at the Voice of College Football.